Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you...
Hey there, welcome to Self-Inflicted Aural Nostalgia, the Guided by Voices podcast, every GBV LP, every 2 weeks. Today we'll be taking a look at 2012's Let's Go Eat the Factory. But first, all music heard in this podcast is played and owned by Guided by Voices. Any reviews or materials cited are owned by their respective creators. And of course, all hail Jeff Warren's Guided by Voices database located at gbvdb.com. Visit everygbvlp.com to subscribe to future episodes or listen to past episodes. And write to me if you want at jeff@everygbvlp.com. Also, I want to mention that next week I'll be posting another bonus episode. It'll be a discussion with Matthew Cutter, author of the new Robert Pollard biography, Closer You Are, which comes out on August 21st from Da Capo Press. We talk about Bob, GBV, his new book, and a whole lot more, so be sure to check it out. Now let's get to the show. Okay, we're now talking about 2012's comeback record, the one that reunited Bob with what's come to be known as the so-called classic lineup, record number 16, Let's Go Eat the Factory. Before this, the last Guided by Voices record was 2004's Half Smiles the Decomposed. The 8-year gap between these two records has so far been, in the 30 years Bob's been releasing material as GBV, the longest stretch between albums. There was once a 2-year gap between LPs and 2 1-year gaps. Otherwise, there's been a new GBV record every year, and sometimes there's been more than one. The record, so far anyway, being 3 in 1 year. Of course, getting rid of the name GBV didn't mean that Pollard stopped releasing music. With Bob being Bob, he kept up his usual hyper-productive pace during GBV's hiatus, releasing dozens of solo records and new side projects. This included records by new groups Acid Ranch, The Moping Swans, Psycho and the Birds, The Takeovers, Carbon Whales, Cosmos, The Keane Brothers, and Boston Spaceships, not to mention Circus Devils. These appeared on a number of independent labels, as well as part of the Fading Captain series, or else one of his own labels. And while each of these undoubtedly had their fans, none seemed to make the same impact as Guided by Voices. This is something that Bob himself acknowledged when he chose the name Crickets for his 50-song Fading Captain series Best Of. People just weren't paying attention. As Pop Matters wrote in the review of the double CD Crickets, if Pollard and his most devoted fans were honest with themselves, they'd realize that Bob's non-GBV side projects may yield the occasional decent track, but are largely without merit. He also wasn't playing nearly as many concerts as he had with GBV. Part of that was on purpose. He'd been burned out on the treadmill of record, tour, record, but staying off the road and being out of the public eye meant that Pollard's profile was the lowest it had been since the band broke back in 1994. So where did that leave Bob? He'd spoken in 2004 about painting himself into a corner with GBV. Had he done the same thing all over again, pinning himself into a different corner? If so, what was left for him to do except, as the old cliche goes, get the band back together? So when his old label, Matador Records, called in 2010, inviting Pollard to play in Las Vegas as part of their 21st birthday party, that's just what Pollard did. Not that it was an easy decision. Back when the band first broke up, in an interview in 2004, Bob was asked, "Can you see GBV doing a Pixie-style reunion in 10 years? Pollard's answer was, "Right now I'm going to say no, but I might change my mind. 10 years from now, if I need some money, I might have to go for it." A few years later, in 2007, he was asked by Magnet magazine, "Now that indie rock reunions are big business, have people started bugging you about getting Guided by Voices back together?" Pollard derided this as mere cashing in, adding, "I don't see Guided by Voices performing." However, he also admitted, "I'm not selling as many records as Guided by Voices did." And then it happened. On June 28, 2010, Bob announced on his website, GBV Classic Lineup Reunites. The guys who had recorded LPs such as B1000 and Alien Lanes would appear in Las Vegas on October 3rd, headlining the festival's third and last day. The celebrations for the label, dubbed the Lost Weekend, would see dozens of Matador bands take the stage, including Sonic Youth, Belle and Sebastian, Liz Phair, Yellow Tango, Fucked Up, New Pornographers, and another iconic indie band from the 90s who had recently reunited, Pavement. And while Bob and GBV were just beginning what was going to end up being a very productive reunion, resulting in numerous tours and LPs over the span of 4 years, Pavement was coming to the end of what would amount to being just a brief asterisk in the history of the band. Other than a greatest hits record aptly called Quarantine the Past, they didn't release any new material and they've never performed together since. And even though there's been some rumblings of another reunion, perhaps in 2019 for the group's 30th anniversary, frontman and main songwriter Stephen Malkmus isn't so sure, recently telling an interviewer, "I'm not so keen on it right now, and I'm full-time with my life, so I don't know if I have time for a Pavement reunion." Bob, however, had the time for a reunion, and so he picked up the phone and started calling. As Tobin Sprout described, it was one of those things I never thought would happen. I mean, there was no reason for it to happen. The fact that Tobin had left the group on good terms assured his participation, him saying, "I didn't even give it a thought," adding, "It's something I've missed ever since I left, and to be able to do it now, to be able to go out and have fun with it, I can't wait to do it." Mitch Mitchell and Greg Demos were still in Pollard's orbit, and so were easy enough to contact and get on board. But tracking down drummer Kevin Fennell wasn't as easy. As Sprout put it, he had just moved around and nobody was really sure where he was. But they soon found him, and then, poof, the classic lineup was together again for the first time since 1996. And when they all got back together for that first rehearsal, Sprout said, "It went great," adding that if you've been friends that long, you just pick up where you left off. For the first song of that first rehearsal, the band played A Salty Salute, the guys standing around somewhat awkwardly until Bob asks, "Shall we?" Greg Demos then kicks in with that bass line. Kevin starts pounding on the drums, and then bam, in just a few seconds, the club is open. The practices went smoothly, and soon enough, the group was off to play the Matador Festival, which by all accounts was a huge success for GBV. The Los Angeles Times wrote, "If Matador 21 were a game, Guided by Voices would have won. They earned the most encores, the most fist-pumping, the most sing-alongs, the most pushing against the stage, and the most chanting of the whole weekend." Uncut magazine wrote that, "The big draw was not the last ever Pavement reunion show, nor Sonic Youth's Sister Heavy set, nor even the possibility of finding yourself at the blackjack table with one of Superchunk. No, the biggest clamor of the weekend was reserved for the reformation of a graying, beer-swilling bar band from Dayton, Ohio." The AV Club said that GBV circa 2010 resembles a group of spry grandpas playing a closing concert at the end of a rock and roll fantasy camp. The festival's other big reunion didn't work out so well. Consequence of Sound wrote of Pavement's set that the two singers were obviously sick of each other and called the show a poor end to an otherwise successful tour. GBV, however, did such a good job and had such a fun time, they extended the reunion to 24 dates all across the country. I saw them in New York on this tour, and they sounded awesome. People were overjoyed, not just to see the band once more, but to see this particular group of guys on stage together again. As Pitchfork wrote in the review of Let's Go Eat the Factory, "A reunion of late-era Guided by Voices would have been nice, but it wouldn't have meant much. These guys were the heroes, the conquerors, the underdogs, the dreamers. As much as I like Chris Slusarenko or even Kevin March or Doug Gillard, those guys weren't there from the beginning. They didn't play on B1000 and Alien Lanes, and that meant something." Bob would later piss all over this idea. After all, he's the one who coined the phrase, so-called classic lineup. But people really did care about this configuration of the band. I'll talk about this more when Kevin Fennell is unceremoniously dumped from the band in a few years. Anyway, at the time, the tour was going so well that Pollard decided to do a record. As he told an interviewer, "I was sitting in a bar in Chicago with Toby, and we just kind of became inspired to do one. We started coming up with titles and art ideas immediately." But rather than take the lessons he'd learned on the big budget records he'd made for TVT, or even the trio of mid-fi LPs he made for Matador, Pollard opted to go right back to the band's origins, the basement. This record would be recorded at home. "We recorded the songs that I had written for the album up at Toby's house in Leland, Michigan," said Pollard. "We recorded it big in the room and then fixed and fucked things up in the mixes." Stuff was also recorded at Greg and Mitch's houses, and to get, as Bob called it, the old lo-fi feel of semi-ineptitude, they occasionally switched instruments. The result was a 21-track record that clocked in at 41 minutes. And while I don't consider Let's Go Eat the Factory to be a great or classic record, it's good, and more importantly, it ushered in a wave of really strong LPs, some of which are as good as anything the band had ever released. And that's an amazing feat when you realize how long GBV's been around for, not to mention when you consider just how good some of those earlier records are. The LP lists two producers, Chief Running Mouth and The Soft Spoken Trout, stand-ins once again for Pollard and Sprout, respectively. Factory came out on the band's own Guided by Voices Inc. label, the name perhaps a nod to just what an identifiable business entity the group had become. No longer just a band, GBV was now a brand. And after a myriad of label names, this one is really stuck, with not just GBV Records, but Pollard solo records, as well as recent side projects like Rickard Wiki and ESP Ohio, also coming out on Guided by Voices Inc. And while I like most of the music on Let's Go Eat the Factory, the cover is just awful. Bob had complained about the packaging of the TBT releases, but hell, they were miles ahead of what he came up with for this album. It looks like a series of photos of a record on a white sleeve, except some of the photos are cropped or made to look weird or whatever. That's about all I can say, except that it's pretty ugly, and one of the few album covers that actually looks bad is a 12-inch record versus a 5-inch CD. Maybe that's because in the larger format there's that much more to dislike. It is, in my opinion, the worst GBV cover. However, the back, featuring a Pollard collage, the same as the singles for the record, showcased the usual GBV aesthetic, and they all looked much better. And while the band didn't produce any videos for the record, there was such enthusiasm for the band's return that they managed to score an appearance on The Late Show with David Letterman. For a group who'd never really had a hit and who weren't on a big record label, this was a huge coup. Forget being indie rock icons, this was broadcast television coast to coast. Even Pollard's parents had to now admit that Bob and the group had finally made it. Of course, that didn't stop the band from not taking it terribly seriously. Greg Demos was so busy making rock star moves that he slipped and fell right on his ass, prompting Letterman to later ask, "You all right?" Reviews for the record were mostly positive. Pitchfork gave the record a 6.9, calling it frustratingly satisfying and a record that, if not quite up to snuff with what came before it on a song-by-song basis, still gets along on the enduring brotherhood of its boozy creators. The AV Club gave it a B+, writing that it only takes a few seconds of hearing Let's Go Eat the Factory to recognize the exact right combination of guys who recorded the band's most beloved records. And while the LP wasn't quite another B-1000 or Alien Lanes, the LP managed to capture a similar mix of in-the-moment inspiration, boozy camaraderie, and unhinged loopiness. Stereo Gum made the LP its album of the week, writing that there's a ton to like here. Of the 21 songs, probably 15 have gigantic, indelible hooks, and you can't front on that batting average. The Guardian, giving the LP a 4 out of 5, called the record exhilarating, a kaleidoscopic burst of ideas and passion and absurdity. Songs tumble into each other, many lasting just a minute or two, yet each one distinct and compelling. If I'm doing my fractions right, Spin Magazine scored the record the same, giving it an 8 out of 10 and writing that the 21 songs here are no more or less inscrutable than the hundreds of tunes Pollard had penned since he last played with his band, but they gel in ways that so many of those didn't, reveling in their limitations rather than trying to overcome them. It's the difference between the White Stripes and the Raconteurs. That last line is spot on. Jack White plays in a bunch of bands, the same as Pollard, and he releases records under his own name, but nothing holds the public's attention more than the White Stripes. Bob was beginning to realize the same thing was true for him in GBV. His valuable hunting knife was turning into a double-edged sword. The NME wrote, "This is unmistakably a Guided by Voices record," as well as declaring Let's Go Eat the Factory to be the band's finest work since 2001's Isolation Drills. An interesting thing is that a number of the reviews spent considerable space praising and welcoming the return of Tobin Sprout. Despite the focus being centered on Bob, as the BBC wrote, it's the songs of Pollard's erstwhile sideman, Tobin Sprout, that threatened to steal this particular show. Tobin's songs, according to the BBC, shine the brightest amid Factory's clutter, with Sprout being the band member who has fully seized the opportunity afforded by this lineup's reformation. In fact, The review decides that Bob is the record's biggest stumbling block, and that many of his contributions here seem slight, half-finished approximations of former glories. Pitchfork struck a similar note, writing, "While Bob seems to reacclimating himself, Factory finds Tobin Sprout more than ready to get back into it," adding that the LP finds him quietly stepping out of the shadows and stealing the show. Consequence of Sound called Toby Bob's co-pilot, writing that it is Tobin Sprout who is the unquestionable hero of this reunion, solely responsible for 3 of the album's finest moments. Whether or not that was hard for Pollard to swallow, I don't know, but all the attention sent Sprout's way may have rankled Bob, who was used to being seen as the group's sole leader. But for the time being, the band was back together, and they'd go on to release 6 LPs in just 2 years. Let's now go through the first one song by song. The record kicks off with Laundry and Lasers. You know that scene in The Force Awakens when Han Solo and Chewbacca climb aboard the Millennium Falcon and Solo says to his friend wistfully, "Chewie, we're home." That's what hearing this song does to me every time, especially when the drums kick in. But it's more than just nostalgia. It's a comfort in knowing that Bob's home too. He's with his buddies, they're in their basements, they're making music, they're having fun, and yeah, it's just like old times, and there's nothing wrong with that. Because what was so great about this lineup reuniting is that, for a few years anyway, there was no animosity. It wasn't some cynical thing done for cash. Like, I saw the Pixies after they first reunited, and they just seemed bored out of their minds. I also saw Pavement on their reunion tour, and they just seemed bored too, except, well, that's the way they always seemed when I saw them in the 90s, but you know what I mean. Whereas with GBV, on this and the next couple of records, it just sounds like they're having fun, and they're inviting us along. It's not unlike the invitation on Mesh Gear Fox Over the Neptune on Propeller, except this time they're less throwing a great party than just having us over for a couple of beers. Also, the record's title gets a mention in the song, Bob writing, "Let's go eat the factory, let's go running in there." Also, Laundry and Lasers was what they called Kevin Fennell's basement. Second song is The Head. Now, lest anyone think after my episode on Alien Lanes that I have anything against Bob's short song snippets, I think this track, which clocks in at not much more than a minute, is a lot of fun. A song doesn't need to be 3 minutes or even 2 to be good, and I think this is a nice example of one of GBV's short songs that actually works. I especially love the burst of the church organ, plus the double meaning of head is fun. It refers to the head or boss of the operation, but also means a person's literal head, which in this case seems to have been sawed off from someone's body. It's all very Barton Fink. It's a fun song, especially since both Jim and Mitch get a co-writing credit. This shows that after half a dozen LPs where Bob received sole credit on most of the songs, GBV was back to being a democratic group, or rather as democratic as GBV ever was. Third song is Donut for a Snowman. This song, much like the donuts it's about, is so good you just want to eat it. It's really a lot of fun. This also shows just how much they'd mastered recording on their own. It sounds really good. Pollard's voice sounds great, and Tobin adds some nice atmospheric touches to the production. And while I know that Bob had it as a lifetime goal to make some big-sounding records, which is why he hired some big-name producers, not to mention got in the guys from Cobra Verde, this song is the perfect example of that lighter, more whimsical GBV that we hadn't heard for a long time. The track actually began as a jingle for the Krispy Kreme donuts that get mentioned in the song. Bob wrote it just for fun, making it, as he said, chicory, like the donuts. But when his manager actually got serious about sending Pollard's composition to the company, Bob got cold feet, saying, "I can't be remembered as the guy who wrote the Krispy Kreme theme." Bob was also approached at one time to write a Budweiser commercial, but balked at having to sing the famous catchphrase, "This Bud's for you." That I don't understand. Donuts are one thing, but beer, what's the problem? Maybe if Miller Lite had called, Pollard would have said yes. Fourth song is Spider Fighter. You know how in Losing My Edge, James Murphy repeats band name The Sonics over and over again in order to drive home just how good and influential they are? I feel like doing that here. Tobin Sprout, Tobin Sprout, Tobin Sprout. Because he's really been instrumental in not just the sound of the band, but also the intellectual and emotional makeup of the group. He's a smart guy, he's a painter. If this lineup was Gilligan's Island, he's the professor. He added a certain something to the band that was lost and therefore missing in later incarnations of the group. And the comparison has been made to the Beatles, with Pollard being Lennon and McCartney, and for good measure, Ringo as well, and Tobin being George Harrison. And I think there's a lot to that comparison, and not just because Lennon and McCartney had 12 songs on an LP while George only had 1 or 2. It's not just about volume or numbers. Because if you look at George Harrison, he was a soulful guy. He was a searcher. Music seemed to take second place to spiritual fulfillment. And Toby seems similar in that respect. He could have said, "Screw my family," and jumped into the drunken excess of GBV head first. But instead, he left the band, went back to painting, and made a couple of really fine solo records. He seems to me the same as Harrison, a whole person on or off the stage. And again, as much as I love Pollard, the contrast between him and Sprout is what made the records they made together really special, and Let's Go Eat the Factory is no exception. And this song is a great example of just how versatile Sprout was. For the first 2 minutes, the track is a stomper with a cool riff, feedback, and a straightforward drum beat. But then, 2 minutes in, the song segues to a gorgeous piano melody that sounds like Let It Be, with Sprout crooning, "And now is the time I make up your mind." It's a really gorgeous moment, and it highlights the kinds of moments that the last 6 GBV LPs had been missing. Next up is Hang Mr. Kite.
Hang Mr. Kite from a broom in the room. Hang Mr. Kite.
This song, built around just some really simple synth strings, is pretty effective, and it shows that getting back together with this lineup and recording on their own didn't have to just mean kicking out the jams. The next song is God Loves Us. This is a really fun track that gives songwriting credits to Tobin, Bob, Mitch, and Pollard's brother, Jim. It also sounds like, in a nod to what Bob has said about them switching instruments, that it's him on drums or Mitch or Jim on bass, since neither of them are exactly in time with the electric guitar. Sprout's repeated phrase, "We are living proof that God loves us," is a subtle rearrangement of the Benjamin Franklin quote about wine being a constant proof that God loves us and loves to see us happy. This quote often appears online, not to mention on t-shirts, as being beer is proof that God loves us and wants us to be happy. But that's not what Franklin said, or rather, wrote in a letter to a friend. And the refrain of "We are, we are, we are" always reminds me of "Whisper to a Scream," the 1983 song by British band Icicle Works. The next track is The Unsinkable Fats Domino. This was the first single for the record. It was also the first new music heard from this lineup since 1996, not to mention it had been 7 years since the last new material from GBV. And needless to say, it was a great song and it was the perfect choice as a single. As the AV Club wrote, The Unsinkable Fats Domino is the sort of punchy, to-the-point pop song Pollard rarely bothers with anymore and can still write very well when he's motivated. Rolling Stone also praised the song, calling it bouncy, brief, and brimming with playful rhymes. The magazine also called it a cryptic ode to an iconic rock pianist. Born Antoine Dominique Domino Jr., Fats Domino was a singer and songwriter who had a bunch of hits in the early era of rock and roll, including Ain't That a Shame and Blueberry Hill. One of the first artists entered into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Fats Domino, unfortunately, finally did sink, dying just last year at the age of 89. The next song is Who Invented the Sun?
In me and know me and
This is a super subtle and gentle song from Sprout, which sees him singing barely above a whisper. The lyrics seem to be a sort of mashup between Plato's analogy of the sun and the allegory of the cave, since it deals with a caveman coming in from the cold as well as the birth of the sun which turns and burns. It's a great example of a song that's short but still sounds and feels fulfilling. Quite unlike, I must say, the next song, The Big Hat and Toy Show. Stereogum called this one of GBV's obligatory mid-album songs where everyone just seems to be half-assing it. I think that about sums it up. The last song on side 1 is Imperial Racehorsing.
Animal action, animal pace, animal traction, all over the place.
At nearly 3 minutes, this is one of the few long tracks on the LP. It's a bit meandering, but somehow manages to hold itself together. It's got some synth horns that are fun, and it ends with a long guitar solo, something we really didn't get with this lineup. Apparently, this is a title that Bob had around for a while, since there's a different song, an instrumental, also called Imperial Racehorsing, which was part of the aborted LP Mustard Man and Mother Monkey, which was an early version of The Power of Suck. Side 2 kicks off with How I Met My Mother.
Fabulous, just fabulous. I wanted to see, I wanted to kill some time.
This is a pretty fun song which gets its name by twisting what was a popular TV show at the time, How I Met Your Mother, which ran from 2005 to 2014. I don't know whether to take the song seriously, which is to say literally, and suggest that it's about the narrator's birth, i.e. it's how he met his mother, or whether it's just a minute of Pollard nonsense. Either way, it's over pretty fast, and then we're into the next song, Waves. Consequence of Sound wrote that this song is well on its way to becoming a bona fide GBV classic, and I agree that it's another really strong track by Tobin Sprout. The song seems to be a dream, or rather a nightmare that Toby's having. His bones are breaking, the ground keeps falling away, and he's losing someone he cares about. Meanwhile, all around him are crashing waves. According to the website mydreamsymbolism.com, dreams about waves are fairly common, and they always bear a big message for you. Like water, waves in dreams often symbolize your emotions. Big waves can also symbolize emotional turbulence and growing uncertainties, but can also be a symbol of growth, potential, and power. With GBV back together and recording a new album, Tobin was probably feeling all of the above, which led to this song. One of the things I also like about this track is that the last minute of it is just music. The band rarely stretches out instrumentally, or just kind of let songs play themselves out, but they do in this one, and it's a nice touch. Next up is My Europa.
My Europa, I want you there in my heart. You can see it if you try.
This is a nice and simple song that features just Pollard singing against an electric guitar treated with a ton of tremolo. In Greek mythology, Europa was a Phoenician princess and the sister of Cadmus, who was kidnapped by Zeus. Europa is also one of Jupiter's moons. I'm not sure to which one Pollard's referring, but either way, it's a pleasant track, foreshadowing Be Impeccable from the next LP. The next song is Chocolate Boy.
Chocolate boy, you fell into the summer, and neither.
This was the third and final single from the record, issued, it should be noted, on chocolate-covered vinyl. It's an absolutely stellar track and shows just how economical Pollard's songwriting could be. It's just a minute and a half long, and yet it feels like a fully fleshed out and resolved song. It's just an absolutely stunning track. And what I like about it is that with Tobin Sprout back in the fold, and now that Bob's not having to consider Doug Gillard's shredding capabilities or Todd Tobias's art rock sensibilities, he's free to create really small gems like this one. The lyrics also go back to the more whimsical nature of some of their early songs. With its mention of a paper man and the chocolate boy of the song's title, we're back in Sgt. Pepper's territory. Speaking of, with all of Bob's attempts to sound like The Who in the late 90s and on the second run of Matador albums, he often eschewed the softer, more psychedelic sound of the Beatles, which this song harkens back to. Next up is The Things That Never Need.
Obviously not enchanted by the people themselves. They do enjoy painting. They're, of course, outrageously.
This is a really interesting song. It's basically a spooky piano being played while some voices speak in the background. The voices sound sort of warbly, almost like computers. It's basically GBV's version of Fitter, Happier. It lasts about a minute long before segueing into Either Nelson.
I challenge you to rock. I challenge you to
The opening lines to this are pretty much an instant Pollard classic, Bob writing, I challenge you to rock. I challenge you to proper drinking. If GBB had a Pledge of Allegiance, those would be the opening lines. As a song, it's okay. I'm not sure who's on the piano, but they have no idea what they're doing. But the guitar and the drums sound good, and if you can manage to black out the piano, it's alright. The next song is Cyclone Utilities, Remember Your Birthday. This song has some pretty cool riffs in it. Mitch Mitchell gets a co-writing credit, so those are probably his. What's funny to me is that the lyrics espouse a whole bunch of advice that Bob himself never takes. Like, the opening line is, know the importance of timing your ideas. For a guy who often releases 2 records on one day or 7 records in a year, I haven't seen him worry much about the timing of his ideas. The lines, oceans of programs in a very useful age, more ways of getting your ideas across, seemed to me to be about the internet. Pollard no longer had to rely on a record label or distribution networks to get his music to his fans. He could just upload something to the web and people would hear it instantly. Or he could just announce a new record or band and people would start pre-ordering it. Also, for a guy who pretty much every publication or critic had admonished for his hyper-productive output, to hear him sing, "Not every voice needs to be heard," is highly ironic. I guess he just wasn't referring to himself. But then the final line gives a clue as to his real outlook. Pollard writing, "Noble experiments spark positive reactions." I have a feeling that Bob counts everything he does in the column of noble experience, and whether or not reactions they create are positive, he figures that as long as we're listening and feeling something, then he's done his job. Next up is the final Tobin Sprout song in the LP, Old Bones. The AV Club called this song the album's strangest, prettiest track, which sounds like Auld Lang Syne sung by a dying android. I don't agree with the robot part, but I do think that this is one of the LP's most delicate and gorgeous songs, and it also does definitely nod to the New Year's Eve classic. The lyrics here are some of the most heartfelt in the entire GBV catalog, Tobin declaring to his love that, "When you're old and gray, I'll still take your hand in mine," and "When your bones are frail, I'll still sleep soft at your side. Oh, my heart is true. My love for you is real." It's a tender and mature song. It's not the GBV of elves and wizards. It's the product of a band whose members were all past middle-aged and having to grapple with facts that they and their companions were aging and that their lives were now closer to the end than the beginning. Another one of the things that really sells this song is how it dead ends right into the next track, Go Rolling Home. And the fact that that song mashes right up to its neighbor gives this run of really fun songs a very B-1000 Alien Lanes vibe. This is Go Rolling Home.
Sin begin, truth be smarter. They say you need to bleed to go rolling home. Slow from
Even though Consequence of Sound wrote that Go Rolling Home lingers too long, which says a lot considering it's 37 seconds long, I don't mind this short song snippet, especially since it segues right into the next track, The Room Taking Shape.
Lingering hills, clumsy with guilt, snaking through cliffs, finding the fear, the room taking shape.
Again, this and the previous song basically feel and sound like one track, and they're both pretty nice, although I wish that Bob had taken another crack at his doubled vocal since it's pretty wobbly. Bass player Greg Demos gets a co-write, so maybe that's him playing acoustic guitar. Final song on the LP is We Won't Apologize for the Human Race.
Stand somewhere to suffocate. Do you enjoy coming down with the hate? Generation X lies in its sleep, innocent as age.
It's only fitting that this, the longest song on the record at 4 minutes and 2 seconds, should follow two of the album's shortest songs. When the band's comeback single, The Unsinkable Fats Domino, was issued the previous November, it was actually branded a double A-side, with this song on the other side, so the band obviously thought highly of this track. It's certainly a great title, reminiscent of the Circus Devils song, Love-Hate Relationship with the Human Race. And it's a fun song too, with some great bass playing by Demos and some synth strings. The lyrics are also interesting, with Pollard directly name-checking his original group of fans, writing, Generation X lies in its sleep, innocent as angels next to Generation Z. Also, the chorus of If you want some, if you need some, sounds really good with some call and response background vocals by Pollard. It's a good end to what's a good record. And while this comeback LP isn't a stone-cold classic, that's okay, because the sheer fact that Let's Go Eat the Factory exists and that GBV had released another record is good news. This LP basically broke open the floodgates for more Guided by Voices records, not to mention some damn good ones, which we'll look at in a few weeks ahead. And that means that this record will always be special in GBV's discography. Okay, that's it for the show. In 2 weeks, I'll be looking at LP number 17, the second of 3 albums the band would release in 2012, Class Clown Spots a UFO. But before that, next week I'll be posting my conversation with Matthew Cutter, author of the new Robert Pollard biography, Closer You Are. Until then, subscribe to the show, leave a review, and God bless the Monument Club.
This on the sex